content of this presentation comes both from the book and from things I've written over the years and are current. Really look at this presentation and you'll receive the presentation itself plus like a 30-page handout following the program as really a toolkit for your own efforts at decency and decoding the decency code, so to speak. But take a look at this list for just a second, because these are things I'm going to talk about in the program itself. And this is a program about pathways that lead to decency-driven cultures. It's an issue on all of our minds this year and going forward. Next slide, please. I want to stress that this is a program about, the book is a business book, but I think as you read through it, and in fact, almost everyone who's editorialized about the book or wrote reviews, we're delighted that this constant refrain that while it's a business book, all of the things we talk about are applicable in all the other lives that we all tend to have, especially our home life. And one of the big issues in cultural work is getting the things we believe and do and permit at home sort of also at work. We'll talk about that very little, but nonetheless, there is this direct connection between your private life and your working life that really is important to work on. So the book, the 4 bullets basically talk about what decency looks like. This is a business case for decency. Many of us have to make this case, believe it or not. And I'll talk about some of the tougher scenarios that we're dealing with that cause indecency problems in incivility. Okay, next slide, please. It's interesting to me the program is actually conditioned on some of the questions that my co-author Steve Harrison and I came across as we interviewed people and talked about this issue. And justified the idea of civility and integrity, believe it or not. And we found ourselves really having to isolate these ideas and talk about them. And this was one of them. Why does this program matter? Why? What about it makes it useful from our perspective and your perspective in particular? And these are the points that kept coming up and talking about. We need to learn how to restore these ideas and concepts, especially over the last few years. We sunk into this era of incivility and indecency, and we need to work our way out of it. But I think, and these are you're gonna essentially, we're building a case for you to think and talk about as this subject comes up, and ideally you're going to raise this subject and begin making it a more constant element in your working life and the working life and private lives of others. Okay, next slide, please. This is kind of interesting, and it really, I call it what we know, because these are things we've learned, research has experienced some of them, but and some of them are just sort of, in a sense, commonsensical. Every absence of decency dilutes the culture of an organization. Absolutely. Institutionalized decency gives everyone in the organization important clues about what works. And we're going to see about the vocabulary of decency. We're trying to be specific about things so that our general approach to things like values and stuff like that are made more specific, and we can translate those into actual language and actual actions people can take, and also to alert ourselves to when these things are not happening. It's all research demonstrates that while we may have a very ethical organization generally, ethics in an organization, which I'll talk about, really comes from the leadership. This is a top-down phenomenon that allows the bottom, those of us at the bottom, to work our way up. And I'm going to talk about this in particular when I talk about an obsession with decency in just a few minutes. Okay, and research by the major ethics organization in the United States, the Ethics and Compliance Initiative, ECI, last year issued a wonderful report which verifies, in a sense, what we already know, and that is the most important influencer in an employee's life is the person they report to. But they focused on the importance of the first-line supervisor as the culture maintainer and the culture alterer in our lives. And this is really wonderful information to have, because I think oftentimes we kind of forget that person, and they know it and they complain about it, but that's another story. But the issue here is to recognize that you have help in this issue from the first line supervisor, who's the one who gets the questions, which we don't, and maybe which we won't even get. But they are enormous allies to us in cultural maintenance, cultural repair, and also cultural prediction and warnings about things happening out there that could be troublesome. Very interesting. Next slide, please. I think it's also important to know what where do I come from? What do I? You got a great indicator in the introduction. After doing this for actually 42 years, this number one is what you already heard this in the introduction. But what I firmly believe is that bad behaviors, illegal behaviors, unconscionable behaviors are essentially intentional. Adults make the decision to cross a line. We're going to talk about the specifics of that a little bit later in the presentation, about where this behavior comes from. But it's adults that make the decisions, and sometimes in your family life, it's older teenagers, to cross a line. They look both ways to see if anybody notices, then they step over it. Nobody notices, then they step over the next line. There's a phenomenon in management that's starting to be studied, essentially called risk addiction. We'll talk about that briefly, but it's based actually on the 12 steps of the Alcoholics Anonymous and stuff like that. It has to do with the patterns of life behavior that come to you as a very senior executive. We'll talk about that too. But the point I wanted to make was bad behavior is intentional. Good behavior is also intentional. We have to choose to do it every day, okay? But that choice is always clear. There's never really, I mean, if you look at the things that we do, often in our own lives, but often in business, we try to fog things up. But everybody knows. I always say, once in a while, someone will look at what I'm talking about. They say, "It sounds awfully familiar, Jim." And I'll say, "Do you have a mom?" And they'll laugh, of course. I say, you heard this when you were 6, when you were 11, when you were 19, when you were 27. I'm not your mom and you're paying me for this, but, it should sound familiar, the things we're talking about today, okay? I'm going to talk about unconscionable behaviors. There is a collection of behaviors that sort of fell through the cracks in most ethics programs, including ours, that identifies and defines behaviors that are by definition unethical. It's very, very interesting. So, you really, and number 6 here really, again, emphasizes and names, which is what we have to begin to do. We have to name these behaviors and explain to the people. On page 20 of your handout, there's actually a definition of each of these terms to help you understand this and to share with others. So everybody knows what we're talking about when we're talking about unconscionable behavior, okay? Next slide, please. We are talking about ethics, and ethics is one of those subjects that everybody likes to make really, really complicated. But in 1975, I came across a book called The Story of Philosophy by Will Durant. Will Durant and his wife Ariel are American philosophers from the last century, basically. But he and his wife wrote this huge, wonderful book called The Story of Civilization, 11 volumes. But in this book, which was written in 1975, but at first actually written in 1926, think of that. I mean, he gave this definition of ethics, which I've always adhered to for years, and that is, ethics is always the search for ideal behavior. This is the question we ask. Forget all the mitigators and all the people who say you can't define this, you can't define that. The question always is, what is the ideal behavior in this circumstance, okay? It's kind of what you begin with when you're going to talk about this subject, or you're going to decide or determine, whether something is ethical or not, or whether something should be thought ethically or not. And again, reinforcing, tone at the top really matters in these circumstances. And again, I'm going to talk about that in a little bit under the concept of obsessions, all right? And just a reminder, we really need to bring first-line supervisors into this ethical structure, but not with big white papers and the rest of it. This simple concept: what is the ideal behavior that we're looking for? Next slide, please. Continuing, just to keep on the concept of what I believe, because all of this influences what I'm talking about today, and I want it to influence you going forward. Okay, so just take a look at the list, and remember that this is a toolbox we're giving you today, and these are elements in the toolbox that make it accessible, interesting, and helpful to others as well as yourself. Next slide, please. It's interesting to talk about it from this perspective because, and I want to start here talking about essentially how unethical behavior begins, because these are things that we hear often as excuses for unethical behavior. All right, but these are the realities of how these problems start. Right, unethical problems begin at or near the top of an organization. When I'm called in, there are always ethical problems involved in crisis situations. It often starts someplace else, and the management is befuddled because it didn't start in Cincinnati headquarters. It started in Sacramento, California, in a branch office. And the problem with this thinking is, of course, if it's in Sacramento, it doesn't matter to somebody in Cincinnati. But the fact is, and what happens is when it finally gets up to the top of the organization, it's usually taken over by someone at the top of the organization, and that's where the problem starts. That's where the decisions are made about when we talk, what we do, what we say, those sorts of things. That's why we have to keep in mind that ethical problems always are a function of the top of the organization rather than someplace else. They're rarely the fault of junior people. It's easy to blame junior people, but when you think about it, who's doing the blaming? The person in authority who's trying to find a way out of dealing with it, right? And again, this is sort of stating the obvious, but it isn't that obvious. It's smart people who create the more permanent ethical problems in an organization. It's not the people in the mailroom, as it mentioned down there below. Silence is the primary promoter and protector of unethical behavior. We have to speak about it, identify it, talk about it. And this is the thing at number 6 in this list. Someone at or near the top always remains silent, which authorizes or requires the silence of others. That's the really hard part. People with power are directing the rest of us, even by saying nothing, they direct the rest of us. Next slide, please. A fascinating article in Harvard Business Review on April 12th of 2018 by this woman, Murdy Wendelsberg. She's really hit the nail on the head. When I read this article, this is what I've learned really in my career about working with unethical behavior. And these are things to remember because these are things that leadership is doing that gets, preserves, or starts these behaviors. The first one is omnipotence. She identified 3 psychological dynamics that lead to crossing the moral line. This is very important to understand, and I know you're going to intuitively understand this anyway, because we're all adults on this call, and we face these problems every day. I used to use another word instead of omnipotence, but omnipotence really works. We're in an environment of people saying yes to you all the time. It doesn't take long for you to expect yes every time, okay? And that's what this omnipotence is. Suddenly, you expect a yes, no matter what you're told, you heard yes, and so you sort of like move ahead, okay? The word I used to use for years was invincibility. Many of you have gone through a master's business program. If you think about it, what did they teach you in that program? That you were invincible. You could leap tall buildings. You could solve any problem without talking to anybody else. You were independently powerful, so to speak. Okay, that's what omnipotence is. And this is a huge barrier to listening, to hearing things actually happen, which is why there's all this vocabulary we're talking about and defining in this program and in the book. Because if we use the vocabulary of the issues we're discussing, it's going to penetrate because, the leaders are adults too, and they've heard this stuff before, that echo from mom years ago, so to speak. They know when they're stepping across the line, okay? Cultural numbness means essentially, people who behave unethically um, we don't even comment on it anymore. You know, it's the vice president, you know, Henry Thompson, who always pats all the girls on their fannies, and you say, oh, that's what Henry does, right? Well, that's assault, but nonetheless, you know, we our culture numbs us to this if we allow it to, and over time, she points out, we justify the neglect of ethical behavior because, you know, we've never done it that way, or we've always done it some other way, that sort of thing. I have some additions to that list, which are important to consider as well. The pattern of unethical behavior, that's a part of it. The first item I add is surprise. You know, when something bubbles up enough to look problematic to a senior leader, they're surprised by it always because they don't believe it happens. They believe they're omnipotent, right? So their reaction is disbelief. You know, this can't be right. It's like, you know, when some gauge malfunctions on something you're working with, you know, so what's the first reaction? Bang on the gauge to see if it's stuck or something, right? They don't believe it. And then their attitude initially then turns to betrayal. Well, if you're bringing this up, you know, Tommy, Mary, Henry, Jerry, whatever, you know, you don't trust me. I don't trust you. This is a betrayal. And it results in the silence that is the most corrosive communications tool we can use. It's silence that destroys the top executive's career, because once you go silent, even if it's for just an hour or two in these urgent situations, you know, it generally winds up being the major criticism of your behavior in that case. The comforting factor for us is they really fire communicators, they only fire bosses. It's easier. Okay, next slide, please. I urge you to begin collecting the excuses. I have these are some of my favorites. You could add on there, I'm not a crook, and then, you know, I didn't have sex with that woman, if you want. But, you know, these are the excuses that we hear all the time. And I apologize for the language, but in writing the book, every time I mention civility, not every time, but at least half the time with major CEOs, they had this reaction. They called civility, forgive me again, a candy ass idea. That pervades in management. That's part of this omnipotence behavior, which we have to crack going forward. Next slide, please. I mean, this is really the truth of the situation. Civility is the foundation for integrity, right? And when you look at this list of things, again, these are definitions to think about and talk about, okay? Small decencies build good companies. Small decencies outside the company build great companies. The biggest problem we have in our culture is that we are so successful in building great companies and finding great leaders to lead them. The problem is many organizations and companies get to greatness before they get to goodness. They skip the good part and just glory in the success that's going on, which is why we often have this turmoil at the top. You know, you may not recall, but Steve Jobs was fired, I think, 5 or 6 times by his board for his behavior and attitudes throughout his working life. And yet, you know, this man changed civilization and the earth. You know, I define something. Trust, I define as the absence of fear. There's lots of definitions of trust, but this is it. You trust people because you feel you can rely on them. You trust products for the same reason. You don't have to fear this, okay? And fear is the absence of trust. We fear things because something has changed in our environment that we don't understand, didn't want, don't appreciate. And candor, which I define as truth with an attitude delivered right now, okay? Candor is the building block of trust. And candor has to do with talking right now, explaining right now, before somebody has to ask the questions. That's what builds trust. So it's candor, which is the foundation of essentially decency, and civility, which is the foundation of integrity. Remember these concepts, teach these concepts. Next slide, please. I always have to bring this up because it's so important to our discussion, all right? Our mothers told us a lot of things when we were growing up, or whoever our parent was. But one of the things they're really wrong about starts when we're very young, and that's the day we get beat up on the playground, go home and cry about it. And our mom or caretaker says, "Oh no, there, you'll be fine." That's sticks and stones and people fighting it hurt you, but words will never hurt you. This is a lie. You learn this by about 6, actually. Um, Words create the most damage, and that's what we're going through primarily in our culture right now. Words that damage, words that hurt. And the difficulty with when you are victimized, and that's the accurate word, by words, is that nobody knows it but you and the perpetrator, okay? Because words create hidden wounds. They're bloodless, they're invisible, they're irreversible generally, they're scarless, and they're unhealable, they're permanent. And we have to think about this. I'm going to go into that in some detail in just a minute. But, it's the creation of victims that creates the crisis. And quite often, in fact, the majority of the time, since victimization is caused by the words we use, we don't think of someone as being injured or harmed, or that something uncivil has occurred, all right? And, I just add this in. Victimization by humiliation is worse than death for these reasons, because you suffer alone. And it's something in a way you can't really explain to people, which is why we have to be so alert about unethical behavior and the word process. Next slide, please. Here's just a brief list of what I call victimization words, okay? And you'll see the word bullying here in the left-hand column. Bullying, studies show that bullying is only 6% physical. It's 94% verbal. We'll give you some examples in just a moment, but take a look at these words. These are illustrations of the things that cause this silent victimization, and we have to be aware of them. We have to root them out of our behaviors and point them out to those who are behaving this way. Next slide, please. We've seen this behavior time and again. It is a habit pattern of bullies, but you have to think about how these words not only hurt, they damage. This is the problem with this kind of behavior, that it's silent. Although, frankly, if someone's humiliated in front of us, we remember it, but nowhere near as vividly as the person who's attacked, so to speak. And we want to think about this as we go through things. This is just what you have to do if you're really into this, is to watch for the words and behaviors and phrases that those around you are using, and begin to occasionally circulate this list. This is one of the lists, the complete list you have in your materials that are in the handout. But I pass this out and I talk about this because, it's a funny thing about when you're a bully. If somebody knows that you're a bully and they talk about it, it can, in many cases, modify their behavior or lay the groundwork for future action to correct these people's behaviors or make them gone. All right. Next slide, please. These are what I call unconscionable behaviors, and they are the enemies of decency. Now, there's a list here, but you have in page 20 of the handout, you have an explanation of each of these terms. So I'm not going to go through them one by one here, but you'll recognize most of them, okay? These are the things that destroy civility. These are the things that destroy integrity. These are the things that create victims, because the attribute of each of these words or behaviors is intentional. You have decided to do this, you know it's wrong, but you do it anyway. Each of these is unconscionable, and you know it. You know that you shouldn't be doing this for a variety of reasons. Each targets to harm someone. These are anti-people behaviors, okay? Each causes few, if any, physical signs of injury. Each causes permanent damage. This is the hard part, especially for those who suffer from this. And many of us in our positions, we suffer from these kinds of behaviors toward us in our working lives. And this is part of the reason. There's no wounds to signify that some boss really chewed you out this morning or somebody belittled what we were talking about, sort of thing. These words rarely kill anything. These aren't mortal wounds, but they are corrosive and permanent wounds. And this list I consider to be per se unethical. Everything from these behaviors is unethical, right? From Jim Lukaszewski's point of view, there's no code, including ours, our code of conduct, that includes even this concept. But when you look at it and you understand it and think about it, this is an enormously damaging set of behaviors. Next slide, please. There are some antidotes to this, and these are 9 of mine. I used to have longer lists than this. Some of my lists are longer than this. Some of my lists were like 20 items, but then a friend of mine years ago sent me a note saying, Jim, for heaven's sake, there's only 10 commandments. So I keep my list of things kind of under 10 if I can do it. But look at the list here. End the silence, speak up, shrug off the numbness that we feel, work within your own organization and your family. Name the offending behaviors. This is the part of it that's so important. Got to say what it is and talk about what it is. Establish support leaders who visibly and aggressively champion civility. I have a great story about that in just a few minutes from my business, my associate, but detoxify language and behaviors, right? Essentially, if we aspire to accomplish things every day, because the incivil behaviors are the ones that stop things from being done. Next slide, please. It's a truism. Decency's enemies succeed when unconscionable behaviors meet silence. Silence is this extraordinary enabler of bad behavior, bad thinking, and problems. We've already talked about this article. I urge you to get a copy of it. I'm not authorized to give you one. And you also recognize this willingness for organizations. I mentioned the older vice president and even the younger one who pats people on the fanny. I mean, we accept behaviors like this. We just say, oh, that's Bill. Or we accept it because Bill may be the best producer in the company. And we make allowances for people like this. And they distort the entire culture by having this latitude and this sort of problematic acceptance of adverse behaviors. We have to think about this constantly. Next slide, please. This is always kind of the question. So, what's the point of all this yakety yak, right? Well, these are the points, right? Leaders and smart people know what they're doing. That's why they're smart people. And that's why problems start at the top of an organization and not at the bottom of the organization. It's so interesting, the pattern when you work in this area. Once somebody is caught, generally, the truth starts coming out. Then there is a sense of personal concern, maybe even shame, although sometimes that isn't possible because these people are omnipotent, even in the errors they make. It's interesting, these things that I'm talking about today, and as all of us know, happen every single day. And sometimes, we'd like to have a day without these things happening, but this is particularly the era we're living in, and we need to deal with it every day and talk about the things that we're talking about in this program to begin essentially getting the consciousness raised of those around us. Because those around us who are not going to do this or don't believe in this are going to talk about it, and they'll be sort of self-identify who your problematic circumstances are. Same is true in your family and working life. I put number 4 in here on purpose because this concept, which surfaced at the very early part of the COVID situation, was a position taken by the business community and others. Sort of the mantra was, look, government, this is the very beginning, don't do things that will be worse than what we're actually going to suffer. And of course, at that time, we didn't know what we're going to suffer. So in essence, what could possibly be worse than what we're suffering? But this idea was floated first in the business community about the balanced approach, okay? Which, lots of discussions about this. It was in the news for days. But essentially, if you boil it down, the balanced approach always allows some bad behaviors as a price to pay for good behaviors. This is insane. So what we've been operating under is this notion of a balanced approach, which essentially says, okay, death is okay so long as we get the dividends, okay? It's really that simple. And or some abhorrent behavior is accepted in part in order to get a better result overall. You have to resist the balanced approach. There are things that are right and there are things that are wrong. And with this grayness that we tend to put into our lives intentionally as an accommodation is terrifying when you sit back and think about it. Next slide, please. This is what we're doing, right? Civility and decency are always about reconciliation, engagement, mutual understanding, trust, and respect, okay? And the point I want to make here is civility, again, and decency are about language. And this is I do a whole program on positive language, but the issue here is to start avoiding the kinds of language that's used, negative language. You need to eradicate that from everything you do and say. There's information on this information in your handout as well. And if you have questions about it, I'd be happy to send you some additional materials, okay? And my contact information is on the last slide. Okay, next slide, please. This is really sort of part of the bottom line of today's program. Learn this mentality of speak up to stop, okay? And this is, you have the entire list in your handout, but this is the flavor of what I'm talking about. When your words or someone's words or deeds or actions turn to vilification, stop. Do something else. When you use sarcasm to ridicule, damage, demean, dismiss, diminish, or humiliate, stop. Just stop. Don't want to explain why we're doing it. Everybody knows why you're doing it. Don't have to somehow alibi for parts of it. Just stop doing it, okay? What you propose is negative, punitive, defensive, or harmfully restrictive on others, stop. Choose another pathway. The book is about pathways to decency, pathways to integrity, okay? Pathways to honesty. When your words exceed the boundaries of decency, civility, and integrity, just stop, stop, stop. We spend so much time explaining things that is just totally ridiculous. Just stop doing it. People notice. One of the most powerful things you can do in your own personal life is to eradicate the use of all negative language. If you can do that, there's a document called The Ingredients of Leadership, which I could send you if you like, which talks about this. You can change the lives of others because you changed your own. Next slide, please. Here's the way to think about it, and I call it the civility credo, okay? The true test of civility is a commitment to verbal, written communication and actions that are positive and declarative, and behaviors that are simple, sensitive, sensible, constructive, helpful, empathetic, and benefit the recipient out of proportion positively to the sender. Any other pathways lead only to trouble, prolonged problems, and delay mitigation and resolution. Paste this on your mirror, okay, in the morning. Have it on your desk where you are. If you're mobile, paste it on your computer, okay, your laptop. In many ways, it's as simple and it's as complicated as this brief statement indicates. The true test of civility are these commitments and the other commitments we talk about, okay? This is something to live by. This is something to teach your family and something to exemplify in everything that you do. Because ironically, civility begins with each of us individually. You can change your world by thinking this way and behaving this way. You can really do this. In fact, as I've said now time and again, you have to do this. These are decisions you make, behaviors you choose. And you unchoose other things, okay? Next slide. I'm often asked to say, well, what does this look like, Jim? Well, this is what I call the ingredients of goodness, okay? And what's interesting about this list is since my career has been built around working with companies who practice the opposite of these things. That's why they're in trouble mostly. Um, I look for those concepts that you can teach and think about and know almost without instruction, that make up what makes us good. And if you look at the companies and organizations that are in trouble, including some of your own, these are things that are missing from this culture, right? You know, the opposite of apology really is arrogance. You know, you could have a list of opposites, but these are the things. The opposites aren't as important as knowing what to do and what to look for and how to behave yourself. And this is the difference often between a good company and a great company. It's why we have so many great companies that have problems. They skip all this stuff to get the sales, so to speak, or to get the visibility, or to get the approbation. But they have to back up at some point and fill in these blanks going forward. What I'm saying to you is, these are things to look for. These are things and behaviors to live by. You don't even have to see a definition of any of this stuff to understand how important they really are. And if you want to be a good company, if you want to be a good person, if you want to be a good organization, a good culture, these really are the ingredients of goodness, the ingredients of a good culture. Next slide, please. My co-author, Steve Harrison, wrote a book in 2008 called The Manager's Book of Small Decencies. It's a little short book, but it's so interesting and filled with just sensible advice. In fact, our book, the book that we're talking about today, the Decency Code, is actually a sequel to that and built on that book as a platform. But, so well, how do I do this? I mean, how do we get started? Well, this is how you get started, okay? It's the way you think and the way you approach things. How can I help you? How nice of you. I can do that. I'm sorry. My pleasure. My pleasure is the opposite of the phrase no problem, okay? No problem is a negative, okay? But, please ask me. I'm ready to help. Please let me help you. Please forgive me. Thank you. What can I do for you? When you think about it, the two most powerful words in almost any language, well, the single most powerful word in every language, positive word, is the word yes. The most corrosive word in any culture is no. And in between, we have these ideas and thoughts processes that we really want to go through, that we can say by using these concepts as approaches to people with problems when problems are moving forward. And if you want to detoxify situations, these are what I call these powerful, simple civilities and simple decencies. And notice again, it's about the language we use, which brings up a sort of an interesting side issue. The Wall Street Journal over the weekend wrote, there was an editorialist in there on do bosses really need empathy? Probably, I think, the dumbest article in the history of the Wall Street Journal, and they often have stuff in there that's bizarre. But this guy, essentially using data from studies, he proposes that essentially, empathy can't get in the way of being an effective manager. I mean, it's like, say that again. Oh, it's written down. It's in the Wall Street Journal. This is an article that is going to circulate among a lot of managers and leaders because it confirms something they believe, that empathy makes you look weak, makes you look like a sissy. We really have to counter that with recognizing that this is what good people do. These items on this slide, okay? Next slide, please. This is a kind of reference slide, but because I want to provide you with as much information that I possibly can in the short time we have together. And when I try to build lexicons, you'll find many lexicons in my writings of various things. And this is the one for civility and decency. And the idea here is to really have a menu of things you can look at to begin to institutionalize in yourself, habituate this use of civility and decency as a starting point. Because someone has to do it. It often falls to us. But what's interesting about this to me, in environments where we're going through processes where we have to start thinking about these things all the time, so many people talk to me about, when I talk about these things, is, I feel so much better because I thought I knew what to do, but I couldn't overcome the behavior of this particular person or group or division. But these are things I can use every single day in my own life and habituate, being civil, being decent, having integrity. Okay. So I think you'll find the list very helpful. And you can start a conversation on almost every single one of these, probably, literally, actually every one of them. And if you have additions, fine. I'd like to hear them, because I think these lexicons can really, I'm going to paste this on your computer if you want to, but, where do we go? How do we start? What do we do? And this is meant to help you be a platform for knowing what to do, knowing what to say, and knowing how to behave. By the way, I didn't make the point I meant to make about empathy. The empathy is, and I want to do that for just a second. We define empathy generally, as this man does in the article, as putting ourselves in someone else's shoes, okay, and trying to look at the world from their perspective. This cannot be done, okay. I mean, in some of the most bizarre circumstances, we think this way. I mean, if someone loses a child, no matter how can you possibly say, I know how you feel and mean it? I mean, even if you've lost a child of your own, you know that nothing can approximate what you're suffering. And yet we tend to believe this foolishness, and we define empathy this way. Put yourself in somebody else's shoes. Well, it's not possible. It's impossible. And more than that, actually, it's arrogant, it's insulting. And all of us have been in this circumstance because we're all adults. We've all had problems in our lives of one kind or another. There's always somebody who comes over, there, I know how you feel. Well, hey, you don't know anything, buddy. So the issue here really is a new definition of empathy. And I define empathy this way. Empathy is doing things that help others, that actually go beyond words. Okay, empathy to me is actions, doing something that helps someone else, not saying something, not whatever. It's actions that demonstrably can help this individual or this family or this group of people move through the darkness that they're currently suffering. Okay, and this is a liberating way to think about it as well, because most of us who've had tragedy in our life or very serious incidents know that no matter how nice the words are, only you are suffering from whatever has occurred in your life. But those of us on the outside who know these people need help can think about it in this new way. Okay. So empathy to me is actions that speak louder than words. And take this to heart, communicators. So often, and we're seeing this during this epidemic, there's so much talk about the good things companies are doing, and yet to me, this is really okay. So it's a PR thing. You don't really mean this. You wouldn't be doing this if we didn't have the epidemic, kind of a thing. And people think this way. There are actions we can take that are so powerful that when you start talking about them, you actually diminish their value. Okay. Actions do speak louder than words. I found there's a phrase like this, and I haven't worked in every culture, but in the cultures I've worked in, there's always a phrase like that in this culture. And take it to heart. It's actions that have meaning and have impact, and they do speak louder than words. Next slide, please. One of the interesting byproducts of civility and this kind of activity is that it is helpful. We talk a lot about employee engagement, but employee engagement is fundamentally a public relations word that management likes. But management doesn't really understand what employee engagement really means. It has two different meanings. From the boss thinks it means a way to get 9 hours worth of work out of 8 hours of actual work time. But the employees have an entirely different view. And management still has struggled with what this actually means for what they think about, and what the employee tends to misunderstand about employee engagement. But think of it this way. Employees generally are people in an organization who live, who work to live. Okay, they work to live. They work. One of the most energizing features of every day's work is going home. And one of the most strange things about the current situation for most of us is we work at home now, so we've lost this marker in the day. And it's something to think about. This slide just talks about and contrasts this concept of what employees assume versus what managers assume. Just remember, a manager and leader has, throughout their career, has focused more and more on living to work, which moves them and distances them from employees who work to live. It's a contrast to think about. Next slide, please. This is something I've discovered, and we've actually had companies who've done research during bad times or crisis times to find out, what it is that employees tend to expect of leaders over time. And so I urge you to take this list to heart, because this is an instruction sheet for leaders. What is it people really want? What are they really asking for? Not only in times of trouble, but other times as well. What are those behaviors by leadership that build trust, that build integrity, that are decent, okay? And this is a wonderful list of items. It's actually much longer than this, but these are the ones that really stand out. And find the truth as soon as possible. Promptly raise the tough questions and answer them thoughtfully. Okay. Teach by parable and story. Think about all of these things which you understand implicitly. Okay. And number 9 is really, really crucially important. Make values more important, or at least equal to profits. Because right now it always boils down to money. Maybe it'll always boil down to money. But if you want to have credibility as an ethical leader, these are the behaviors that tend to prove that to employees. Next slide, please. Changing the world starts with you, okay? And this is a list of things to think about, okay? If the perpetrator is someone you know, find someone else to know. If the source is from someone you buy from, find another source, right? If the source is someone in public life, disavow them as vocally as you can, and vote for somebody else, I guess. If the source is someone who calls you a friend, find new friends. If the source is someone who comes from a local pulpit, find another pulpit. If the source is the media platform or a celebrity, cross them off your list and go someplace else, right? If where you work or what you do is unconscionable, you only have one choice. You're not going to change the organization. You need to find another place to work. Next slide, please. And again, this is an interesting list. And part of it actually comes from the woman I married 60 years ago. She passed away a year ago, but during her life, she was the happiest person you'd ever meet. And if you knew her name was Barbara. She was just always happy and always bubbly and always helpful. And we did talk about this from time to time, and people remarked about it, about her especially. And so there was a time in which we sort of sat down trying to figure out, what is this you do what is it you do that makes you so desirable to all these people? And this is kind of the list we came up with. So I want you to take this list at heart. I didn't call it Barbara's list, but it's really Barbara's lists of how to have a happy life. I mean, after all, that's what it's about, isn't it? How to have a happy, useful, productive, and meaningful life. And these are kind of the ingredients in doing that, which made so much sense to me when we started to identify them. And I thought you might find them helpful. Next slide, please. So this is your mission, if you choose to accept it. And this is actually part of a construct by my writing partner, Steve Harrison. It really is things to think about, things that you can do, things that you can look for to help bring decency back, encourage decency, and encourage, encourage integrity in your organization. It's a lot of items. It's more than 10, but these are things again to think about as you're going forward as problem identifiers that you can help other people correct in their own lives and in your organization. And it is a mission. As I was, I'm actually in graduate school. At 78, I'm in graduate school. Anyway, I'm writing a paper on advocacy, and in that paper, I'm trying to establish a way that we can codify in law decency and management integrity. And talking to my co-author about it, Steve Harrison's 84. He's running a company with his name on the door since 1990. An amazing person. And he said, well, Jim, I see what you're doing here, but the one ingredient you have to have is obsession. I said, obsession? He said, yeah. If you want this to work in your organization, the person who runs it has to be obsessed with integrity, obsessed with decency, and he or she has to transmit this decency, this obsession into the leadership of the organization, top to bottom. Then you'll have an organization that you can be totally proud of and immune from a lot of things, including all that list of horribles I talked about earlier. So think about it this way: who in your organization is really obsessed with integrity and decency, and how do we get the people who we all work for to develop this sense of obsession with decency? Of the 300 companies I worked for in my career, I'm in touch probably pretty frequently with about a dozen of the executives of that company, even many who have retired. And as I thought about Steve's comment, why am I talking to these people as opposed to the 288 others? And the answer is these people caught the obsession with integrity and decency, and it became a part of the driving force of their lives. And it's really amazing and an important part of my own history, but something to think about. You've got to be obsessed with this to really be persuasive and make it work. And basically, it's got to be people at the top to begin with, all right? Next slide, please. We're about to, I will go to questions in just a second, but I want you to ask yourself these questions as soon as the program ends, all right? This is really how to maximize what you learn from this hour we spent together, right? These questions: most important thing you learned, most interesting thing you learned, most memorable thing you learned, what questions have been raised in your mind that you need answers for, and feel free to contact me about that. What will you do differently tomorrow because of what you learned today? And what do you know now really that you didn't know at the start of this program that's going to benefit you in some way? Many of us are working virtually. When we are in virtual meetings and we notice indecency in the words of other participants, what is the best way to immediately confront the indecency? Should we use only positive language in addressing, or should we be silent and speak up to the person about it, perhaps even after the meeting? No, I'm sorry, yes. You need to confront it. What I do, and it's irritating to some, but people help us. When someone says, well, that's not a part of our culture. I like to say, well, what would be helpful if you tell us what is a part of our culture, okay? It's converting negatives to positive as quickly as possible, because that's how they start. I wouldn't do it that way. Well, give us a hint at how you might do it so we can think about it, okay? I don't doubt that you're right. Well, what does that mean? Am I right or am I not? Well, the question is, here's what I mean, all right? I don't speak for anyone else. Well, here's what I think. Here's what I mean. Let me clarify what we're talking about from my perspective, okay? And the corrections have to happen politely, but immediately, okay? And, you're not calling somebody a dummy or an idiot or an arrogant, whatever, okay? You're simply offering this approach. I do it part of the reason I'm around is to teach this to the people who run the place. And so we're in meetings and the CEO makes one of their classic comments, that doesn't really fit with our culture. I intermediately think, well, Tom, give us a couple of examples of what you think might work in this culture. One of the favorite negative comments is, it didn't work 5 years ago when we tried it, it's not going to work tomorrow. Well, it's a double, triple negative, right? Well, again, so let's talk about what really works, okay? You got to skip to try to compensate for the denial and go for the positive action. This is why this concept of learning about positive language is so crucially important to you. But the answer to your question is correct it now, politely, declaratively, pleasantly, and persist in trying to tease out or just volunteer your own positive interpretation of things. It helps everyone. Every time I go through this in the meeting with people, people come to me afterwards and say, God, thank you for, he always does this in meetings and it stops the conversation. But, this is so great of you. And the fact is, all of you can do this. Make it a habit. It's a habit everybody around you is going to appreciate. Maybe not the person who's running the meeting, but ultimately they have to accommodate it too. And maybe you want to talk to them afterwards as well and tell them what you're doing. So the moment these executives and these powerful people, practice this invincible behavior, they can think twice about it themselves and correct themselves going forward. This is part of that obsession I talked about earlier. This is a very good question. After the meeting, it doesn't matter, because when meetings are over, right? And especially now when you're meeting it, virtually, sometimes the meeting is over even before it ends for you. But it's really important because this behavior helps absolutely everybody in the meeting. It teaches them how to get these situations handled, and the temperature goes down immediately with this, and people pay attention because all of a sudden they notice a way to handle this circumstance. Another question. See here. What are the decencies as opposed to ethics, morals, and common business etiquette? I think, I would say decencies are intentional. We think about this. We do these things. We also think about ethics as a live subject, as a part of decencies and that sort of thing. And we are talking, the question talks about morals and common sense etiquette. Morals are difficult because we have such a mixture of people in our lives these days and a mixture of backgrounds. But it's interesting what I found in my career, and I work exclusively in bad news, is that there's very few ways people screw things up. Okay, they're always intentional, and as I've mentioned so many times now. But what's interesting about this business of what's the difference is that decencies are intentional. Okay, you look for opportunities to be decent. You look for opportunities to be humble. You look for opportunities to be nice. It has an impact. And there's always, particularly in business circles at the upper levels, there is this, testosterosis factor that exists in women and men. And sometimes, you get labeled. In the situations I work in, I am teaching, I guess you could say, a set of morals, but I simply look at them as important constructive behaviors. Okay. I had one executive after a particularly difficult case in which, in fact, the CEO was the third CEO since I arrived. Several people went to prison in this particular circumstance. The company suffered huge fines and things, but I managed to last throughout all the iterations of legal teams and the rest of it. And at the final meeting, when the situation finally got resolved after 7 years, and the new president of the company, who actually never liked me, introduced me as being a voice of help in the process of getting this problem resolved. And he says to me, Jim, whenever you're around, it feels a lot like Sunday school. And my response was, well, Tom, if my company had just pleaded guilty to 340 felonies, I think a little Sunday school might be in order. Don't you agree? And everybody got a great laugh out, of course, except Tom. But he only lasted another 90 days. There was another new CEO who came in who liked me, okay? But this is powerful stuff, and I want you to really think about using it, all right? Thank you so much for the time today. And I think there's some closure details you have to take care of with the program.
Thank you, Jim, so much for such an outstanding program and a great handout. It's going to be a great reference source. We really appreciate it. Your insights, your stories, and the practical tips are tools that I know we can all start using for our work in our private lives right after this meeting. I'd also like to thank our past chapter president, Teresa Zumwald, for serving as producer for today's program. A big thank you also to Abby Ernst, Jim's executive assistant, for helping with logistics.